Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I'm a project MVP. I've had the title for 4 years. I've got over 10 years of experience with Project Pro and Project Server. Done over 35 deployments, 15 migrations, passed a lot of certifications. I've done the technical read for many books, and then I have my blog at My Project Expert. And this is a little bit about Trusted IT. It's a Gold Microsoft PPM partner. I'm not going to read all that, but as you can see, we are a Gold partner, and many of the consultants that work for Trusted IT are project MVPs. So let me tell you a little bit about my experience about PMO monitoring, and then we'll talk about what PMO monitoring is. But over the years, I've gone into organizations and worked with their PMO, and I always first try to understand, what their vision is and what they're trying to do. And then as I get involved with different project managers and resource managers, often I'll find things that may be going wrong. And at first I just took a note, but over time I started going, how can I proactively avoid these problems? And so as I worked with the different project managers and worked through cycles, PMO cycles, and when I say cycles, cycles are things like timesheets are submitted or task sheets are submitted, and the project manager updates your schedules, and all the different things a project manager does. As I kind of saw what was going on and what was being forgotten and what was missing, and all the different pieces of a PMO, I started putting together how can I proactively look at the PMO and find that missing information and get it corrected before it becomes a problem. So it's through this many years of experience and working with project managers, I've come along with this concept called PMO monitoring. And the other thing you got to remember, and most of you are aware of, every PMO is different. So I can't just give you a bag of monitoring things to monitor, because often if I gave you a bag of aspects to monitor, many of them may not even pertain to your organization. So let's talk about what PMO monitoring is. And so basically, this is the agenda. We'll do an overview. I'll give you a roadmap. We'll look at some metrics, look at some tools that you can put together, maybe some dashboards, and then putting it all together. We already did this slide on who you are. And I was kind of amazed from the polls. I was seeing roughly 50%, maybe, really it kind of went back and forth, but roughly 50% of the people currently are already doing some kind of monitoring through automation. And that's good, because in my experience, I've been in the PMOs I've been in, I really haven't seen any monitoring. So that's interesting, and I like to talk to you guys that do monitoring just to learn more about what you're monitoring. I also like to talk to the people who aren't monitoring and see how I can help you. So in real life, we're always monitoring. We monitor our health. We get our blood pressure checked, our blood looked at, and we check our weights. We monitor our speeds, on how fast we're going. We monitor our banking account. If you look at an airplane, they're monitoring a lot of different things to make sure that plane is flying safely. So everything in our life, we do a lot of monitoring. But so often in a PMO, we don't do as much monitoring as we should be doing. Most of you project managers are very familiar with the PMBOK and the 5 process groups. So we have an initiation process group, and then once a project becomes a real project, it goes through planning, and then we execute our plan, and then we do some more planning. And so we have this cycle of planning and execution, and finally, eventually, we close out the project. If you'll notice, in those four stages, it's all encompassed around some kind of monitoring and controlling. So as a project manager, your job is to look at your project and make sure everything is happening so you can be successful with your project. PMO monitoring is kind of the same thing, except the PMO is not monitoring so much one project. It has to monitor all the projects. And so that's what I'm trying to show here. You may have several projects going through initiation stages, and you need to track and see how well they're going and the data is correct. And they may go through one or many gates before they become an actual project. And then once they are a project, every project manager probably does his schedule a little bit different. And so you may have governance around your project schedule. And in that governance, sometimes it gets lost because either new project managers come in and they don't realize it, or even experienced ones may accidentally delete stuff. So that's one big aspect of it. But also in a PMO, there's other things we have to monitor. Working with project server, you need to monitor and make sure the right people are having the right roles. An example would be we have an administrator role, and typically only maybe 2 or 3 people have that role. If you're monitoring your PMO security roles, you might want to check to make sure you don't have like a lot of people in there, because if people have administrative rights, they have a good chance of changing data inappropriately. And then another really big piece of a PMO is our enterprise resource pool. And we need that particular aspect has a resource profile, and it's got data associated with the resources, and there's capacity planning around that. So we want to monitor that and make sure that is well maintained.
At the tone, please record your message. When you've finished recording, you may hang up or press 1 for more options.
Oh, what's that? Hold on a second. Let me text Daniel for a second. Okay. So, and then you have a PMO has some PMO governance. And what I've seen with PMO governance, especially mature PMOs, they spend a lot of time writing, and they create this big book, maybe 1 inch or 2 inches of documentation that nobody reads. And it's good to have that PMO governance, because at least you know what someone's thought through the whole process. But the next step is to take that governance and see how you can automate it such that everybody is following the governance. And that's what this topic is about. How do you monitor and automate it? So some of the things you're going to want to look for, and you do it step by step, is you want to look for accurate and timely data. And to me, there's like 2 areas that you have to look at in your schedules and then in your resource pool. You want to look for invalid data. It's very easy to have invalid data, either something's mistyped or selected improperly, or as things change, the data doesn't get set up correctly or becomes invalid. The other thing you might have is missing data. So you've got data in your enterprise resource pool, and it's gone, or you don't use it in your PMO. If you don't use it, that's fine. But if you do use it, you want to verify that you got that data in there correctly, and that it's not missing. And the same with schedules. You have data in there, and you want to make sure data is not missing. And then finally, you might have conflicting data. And I see this a lot in the enterprise resource pool. It's something, an example would be you have a resource, they're an employee, and now they become a contractor, or maybe it's a contractor becoming an employee, but the resource profile probably needs to change based on this person's different status within the company. So now you've got what I call conflicting data. And we'll look at that even closer. Then the other things we have to look at is making sure we have timely execution of our PMO cycles. And those PMO cycles might be statusing your project schedule, publishing your project schedules, making sure resources are updating their timesheets and task sheets on a certain day. Let's say they do it on Monday, and we'll talk more about that. And then there's other standards and governance that need to be met and by having all your data in a database, you can look for that kind of information and seeing that it is being followed. And when things aren't being followed or when things are not happening, you can just send out a reminder, email reminder to do some kind of corrective action. And the thing about this, I hate email. I mean, I get so much of it, it drives me crazy. But if people are reminded of things and they do it over and over again, hopefully they're going to build some good habits and they won't get those reminders anymore. Like submitting your timesheets by 10 o'clock Monday morning, or publishing your project schedules by Friday at 3 o'clock. Things like that. So how do we build a roadmap? Well, what would be the steps for building a roadmap? So the things I would start off as, I would look for key PMO governance metrics that are real pain points in your organization. Once you identify the big ones, kind of think it through on how you can identify them with some kind of manual monitoring. And we'll talk more about manual monitoring, but that's things like looking at views or having spreadsheets where somebody actually looks at things. And then once you get a manual monitoring in place, then the next thing you may want to do is build some automated processes that'll do that same kind of thing, but nobody has to do it. It'll be a job that runs every night or every certain times a day, and just reminds people to get certain things done. And then we can build some dashboards to look for trending and to see how well our PMO is working. So after you hit it one time, you repeat, and you keep going through this process, and you're being proactive, looking for things that can help make your PMO run smoother. Now, the key PMO governance metrics that I've kind of identified here, you should have some kind of project standards, you should have some kind of resource standards, and you should probably have some PMO standards. They're probably all written in that large book that you have, but again, you want to identify the big ones, and the things in the project standards, like in schedules. If you've got gates in your schedules, just make sure they're still in there. Or if you got baselines, if you're using baselines, so that kind of metadata, make sure that the baselines are being saved at the appropriate time. There's a whole lot of things we can talk about in schedules, and I'm going to actually get deeper in things you can look for in a schedule. And I've seen some tools in the market that can help a project manager build good schedules, but with Project Server or Project Online, and those are really one and the same, when you have it all in the database, then you can look at all the projects and see if everybody's following the standards. Same with project workspaces and documents. As a project moves through different gates, there should be certain documents that you can search for and look for in your project work sites, and just validate that they're there, and perhaps they need to be signed or approved. There's a historical snapshot that I think is kind of important because a snapshot kind of shows you where you were last week or last month, because many of you know that in project we don't really have any versioning or any history of what's going on in the past. So it's good to kind of have some snapshots, and we'll talk about how to set those up. And then I have this thing called a project schedule conformance index, and this is a way to weigh how well your project schedules are written based on your PMO standards. Then we have resource standards. So in project we have an enterprise resource pool. There should be standards set for those and validated to make sure that they're kept properly. Some PMOs, anybody can update the resource pool, and in others, only one or two people can update it. So if you're in a PMO where many people can update the resource pool, which is fine, you need to monitor to make sure everybody's managing those resource pools properly. And then there's some other things you can monitor, like vacation summaries. Again, you can do a historical snapshot and also kind of monitor the security roles. And then this final governance metric is making sure timesheets and task sheets are submitted at the right time. Maybe it's Monday morning or Monday by noon. And then if you do have time sheets or task sheets, make sure the approval statuses are being done. Maybe that's done on a Tuesday. And then Wednesday, maybe the project status dates are being updated and republished. So those are, again, just some ideas on the kind of things that we can monitor. So now I'm going to dig a little deeper into project metadata. And this is where I was saying when I was working with project managers on site and understanding where they were having problems, often the problems they were having is because data was missing or they were following some kind of bad practice. And again, maybe it was because there was missing data or baselines weren't set properly or not set at all or reset when they shouldn't be set. If your PMO has deadlines set in their schedule, if they're missed, you might want to have some kind of tool to send to the project manager saying, this deadline's been missed, and that might be a good reminder to let them know. I mean, they should be aware of it already, but when they miss a deadline, what can they do to get that project schedule back online? One of the big things I often see in a project schedule is the project manager and the status manager are mismatched or not the same. And what happens here is, and this is a real easy thing to fix, but often a PMO creates a project and then when a project manager is assigned, they just change the owner, but they forget, or not that they forget, the status manager is not getting updated to reflect that these people are the same. So the project manager's submitting and publishing, but he's not getting any updates. Anyway, just a simple query to compare the project manager and the status manager is a great way to prevent problems later down the road. Missing documents we've already talked about, and then monitoring the risk and issues. All that kind of stuff is real important. And again, I talk about this project conformance index. I'm going to go into more detail about that in a little bit. So this is just an example of having views showing missing data. So that all you have to do here is create a view, put up some key fields that you want to make sure are there, and then just eyeball it. Like in here you see the column and the contract. This is probably not critical data because it's all blank, but if it was critical, you'd want to see values in all those fields. Here in the second column, budget requirement. Well, that budget requirement was missing. So if as a project manager, I might want to get an email saying, hey, did you realize in this project schedule you forgot to put your budget requirements? Maybe it's too early in the process and it's not required. But as it goes through the different gates, the different gates may be a clue on when fields are required to be inputted. Here's just another view. Now, the first one is just projects across the PWA or the PMO. Then for each project schedule, you can have a view looking for missing data. Again, like this one, I have flag status is missing, and maybe it's not critical. Maybe I don't even need to watch it. But when I look on lines rows 5, 6, 7, and 8, I see I don't have any work assigned. That may be a problem depending on which gate you are in the planning process. I can see right here no resources have been assigned. So a notification could be you've got a project schedule, you're in this phase, you don't have anybody assigned. Maybe you don't know who that person is, and perhaps you need to put a generic in there. But if your PMO governance says you're going to have somebody assigned, then this would be a violation of that, and so the project manager could be reminded to fix his project schedule. And this thing I talk about historical snapshots, and there's many different ways you can do it, but basically you go in the project database, do a query, pull out summary data for the whole project, for all your projects, or you can pull out summary data for just project schedules. Do it by week, by month, by resource. I mean, there's all different kinds of dimensions, and save it as a spreadsheet. And so what will happen is, maybe a month down the road, there was an issue, and someone says, well, this data is not correct, and I don't know what it was, what it looked like before. with these historic snapshots, you can go back and see what those values were, and perhaps fix that schedule with the correct date based on the history. Monitoring resource data. Same kind of thing, except in the enterprise resource pool, we probably have some fields that we don't want to have missing, and so we want to monitor that. Maybe the resource profile is not set up properly. And the resource profile, this really is based on how your PMO is set up and what's required. So one example is this, often I'll see if you're using timesheets, employees' time doesn't have to go through an approval process. So they're set up as self-approved. So if you scan the resource pool, you would want to make sure all the employees are set to self-approve. If they were contractors, you would just want the opposite. You would want the timesheet manager to show something like a person to approve his time. So that's what I mean by scanning the enterprise resource pool and just validating to make sure it's properly defined. Or if you're using RBSs, it's not required to use them, but a lot of companies do. But if you are using them, those fields shouldn't be blank, because if they are blank, the security within your PMO is going to work differently. So you might want to run a scan of all your work resources just to validate that your RBS is not only has data in it, but it's set up properly. And sometimes you can, like an RBS, the RBS might fall in one department, but then if you compare it to maybe a timesheet manager or a task manager, if they're conflicting, and this is when you have to understand your data and compare data that you do know or do have and compare it with other data and kind of extract if this is valid or not. Checking to make sure resources in the right security groups. For the most part, I'm not concerned if who's in the team members group, but when they're in the project managers group or the resource managers group or the administrators group, some of the big powerful security groups, I might want to eyeball it to make sure the right people are in there, and then when people leave the company, that their names are removed. And then I want to monitor if employees are logging in. I mean, if they're using the tool, they should be logging in. And I have a whole topic just about, what do you do? What does it mean when someone hasn't logged in? And then another thing is that when employees are terminated, you want to make sure that resource is set to inactive. And because you don't want project managers assigning work to a person that's left the company. Again, a lot of things to monitor. This is just a few things that have come to me. So I'm going to take a real deep dive in just monitoring the resource pool. And I'll go through this quick. What's your display name? You want a name that's meaningful. Sometimes you'll have a person's got two accounts, and one's an admin and one's not. So if it's an admin, you might put something in there. It's a good idea not to have a blank email address, especially if you're trying to send them email through PWA. Initials. By default, it gives you one initials. I don't know if that's enough. I always like to have at least 2 or 3 initials. Hyperlinks, the same kind of thing. It's not really critical, but it's a good piece of information to have in the profile so the project manager can quickly find out more about a person. Now this next one, I often do see blank, and it really needs to have a date in there. Everyone should have a date in the earliest available, even if they're an employee. And the date should be something, maybe the first day the PMO got started with Project Server. And the reason is, as resources come online, if that's blank and a project manager sees that resources and puts it in his schedule, he can start allocating time to that resource. And he may not even be there. And what's real common is a new employee comes online. He's coming in at the end of February, but we put his name in the enterprise resource pool today. And so a project manager starts scheduling all this work between now and forever. but he doesn't even get there to the 1st of March. If the earliest available date was provided in there, the project manager wouldn't be able to assign time prior to that date. And the same thing with latest available. Now, this is probably okay to leave blank for employees because we just assume employees will be there until they retire. But contractors usually have an end date on their contract. And as a best practice and something to monitor is to make sure the latest available date has a value in there. And the same kind of thing happens there. When you have a latest available date, a project manager really can't schedule work past that point. And again, a project manager may not know when these start and stop dates are, but if it's in the enterprise resource pool, it'll help them. Having standard and overtime rates, and most places don't put a rate in there, but you could put a blended rate or $100 an hour or something, because it gives the project manager some idea of cost. Custom fields, and this is really based on your PMO. Those custom fields can be keys on how to monitor your data. One custom field I see a lot is like whether they're an employee or not. If they're an employee or a consultant, it's a good logic break on figuring out what the rest of the enterprise pool data should look like. Security groups we talked about, and group fields. There's some free-form ones in there. If you're using them, you might want to do some kind of sanity check to make sure everybody's typing things properly. That if you have a group that everybody's using the same typing, I would suggest using a lookup field instead. But if you are doing these free-form fields, do some sanity checks on them. And here's where I'm looking for missing data. Again, it's a simple manual way of looking at a view, and when I see white space, I know that's missing data. Same kind of thing with snapshots. Just like we did with projects, you might want to do a snapshot of the resources by project, resources by week, resources by details, their vacation hours. Maybe just a snapshot of the enterprise resource pool just to know what it looked like a couple of weeks ago in case you have to roll back and see what data look like. And I often do a snapshot, put it in an Excel spreadsheet, and then just save it in some file share or a documents workspace. And then finally, I've talked a lot about the project conformance index. And so this is project schedules. They vary so much between every PMO and every project manager. And so what you want to do with a project schedule conformance index is come up with some very basic things that you would like all the project managers to follow. Some examples of that is, maybe you've got phases or gates in your project schedule. If they're in your schedule, there's no need to delete them, but sometimes a project manager fat fingers and deletes them by mistake, or renames them, or does something to them. So you want to monitor the schedule to make sure those things are still in there if they're supposed to be in there. Or if you're using missing, if you've got milestones, and a milestone is supposed to have a deadline, just validate that all the milestones have a deadline date in there. You might check all the different tasks, have resources assigned to it. You might count how many tasks are in a project schedule. If you got too few, that would probably lower your score of your index. If you got too many, that can also lower your score. So you should have a sweet spot of how many items or how many rows you want in a schedule. And I understand every schedule is different and every project's different. But you could break it down in large projects, medium projects, and small projects, and that could be a custom field, and that custom field could dictate how many lines. A lot of companies have a special task attribute for capital versus expense. Make sure that all the tasks have those fields in the schedule. And then as you go through different gates, you might have different baselines that are set. So your schedule, your index looks at all those things, and so what your PMO needs to do is design what's important as a best practice, gives minus points for bad practices like too many lines or too few lines, and get points for good practices, and try to come up with a score between 0 and 100. And then once you have that score, then the PM can his project can be weighed and through a report audit. And here's an example where I've just put a handful of metrics for a project schedule. Like I've got task less than 20 and task count greater than 500. Now I'm planning this in a Excel spreadsheet. Once I get this plan together and come up with some kind of scoring mechanism, then I'm going to write a SQL statement to implement this Excel metric, this PMO metric that I've come up with, and hopefully come up with some kind of conformance index score. So now I can run this against every schedule that's in my project server or project online, and then I can chart how it looks each month. So in this chart, January green means that they met the standard. There's a certain score that you consider a standard, and then there's another score that says it needs an improvement, and then finally you have a score that indicates what it's below. And so each month, as you go through this conformance index, hopefully the more and more of the project schedules are meeting the standards, and that's what I'm showing here. After 6 months, we now have 56 schedules that are meeting the standard, and then we have just a few that aren't meeting it. So another thing you can do with it, for those project managers that are real good in meeting the standard, they can coach those project managers who aren't meeting the standards to make sure everybody understands how this works and why it's so important. Same kind of thing could be done for the resource conformance index. You put some, and this, I don't see this as often, because usually you have 1 or 2 people that manage the enterprise resource pool for the entire organization. But for those companies that have 2, 3, 4,000 people in their PMO, and they often have different departments managing the enterprise resource pool, but it's all one enterprise resource pool, then you might want to put together a resource conformance index and see how well each department is managing their resources in their enterprise resource pool. And here I've done the same kind of thing with missing data and resources without assignments and resources that are over allocated. And I haven't really talked much about over allocation, but over allocation would be a good metric to make sure that employees aren't over, I'd say like 200%. Often I see resources are like 10,000% over allocated, just because a new project manager comes in there not really familiar with project and starts assigning a lot of parallel tasks, and all of a sudden that resource is way over allocated. Well, this resource conformance index could be something to help you identify that, so you can make corrective actions early before often you get to the end of the year and you're trying to come up with reports and your data needs a lot of fixing. You want to fix this on a week-to-week, day-to-day type basis, and it makes your PMO run smoother. So some of the techniques, I'm kind of running out of time, but I'm going to go through this somewhat fast. Have a weekly checklist. Just use out-of-the-box PWA views, custom views, where you can look at the Resource Center and Project Center and just look for missing data. Delegation's a great tool also to see what's going on, because with delegation you can go in as a different people and look at their time sheets or task sheets or project schedules. And then finally is putting together like a spreadsheet, and having a spreadsheet with all the things that you're monitoring. And I'll give you an example of that. So we've seen this already. This is basically a view. We can quickly see, we can see missing data. We can't see invalid data. And going back to this view, last connect. So you see that last connect for two people. So what does that mean? And this is again where you're kind of extrapolating data or the meaning from the data. So when that last connection is blank, does it have a special meaning to you, or does it mean anything if that last connection is like 2 weeks old? It might not be blank, but they haven't been in it for 2 weeks or 30 days. Well, you can extract a lot of things from that. So if it's blank, it might mean the user's not using PWA. Maybe they don't have access to PWA. Could be they're just unaware of using it, or they need training. They've been told to use it and they're so scared. So when I see a blank last connect, I can start putting wheels in place and finding out why that resource is not at least logging in, updating his task sheets or time sheets. And maybe you don't use that, and so it's not even important. But again, it becomes a trigger when you see things monitoring the data. So here I'm just showing that any view that you create, you could basically have a SQL statement written to produce that same data, and then you can push it into a spreadsheet. And here I've got an example. I've got a spreadsheet with a few tabs on it. I'm looking for last connects being null, trying to see why that is and who those people are. Maybe I'll check on the monitoring of the cycles, make sure who hasn't submitted their timesheet or task sheet this week. Maybe in project monitor, I'm checking to see if those project managers that haven't republished their schedules in 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, I would assume a project manager publishes every week because he's updating his schedule and submitting those changes. So the key point here is your spreadsheet can be used to have all your monitoring. And here's just some other things that you can monitor. So after you monitor it manually, you might look at your process workflows, and that's what I'm just showing here. Is resource submits time, something checks the time sheets, task sheets, make sure they're submitted, project manager approves. So you have these events. So if Monday people are supposed to submit time sheets and task sheets, the ones that don't, you send them a reminder. On Tuesday, maybe the project statuses and timesheets approvals have to be done. If they're not done by the end of the day, maybe you send a timesheet, a reminder to the project managers. And then finally on Wednesday, maybe all the schedules need their status dates updated and published. And if they don't, you send a reminder. And that's what I'm talking about, the PMO. Whatever your governance is, that's where you have to pick out those dates and times and when it's late and when it's a reminder. And these were just some screenshots of monitoring. So some of the tools that I would use for monitoring, I would use, SSRS is a great tool that can run every day or weekly or monthly. Producing a report showing all the people that haven't submitted their time, task, or published. I like that, but it's kind of a shotgun. What I really like to use is SSIS, where you can do those same kind of queries, and instead of sending an email to everybody, maybe you can send an email to individual people. But this one takes a little bit of logic and planning, but it's more effective. And then you can also use like a Windows scheduler or a SQL Server agent to generate reports and notifications. And I've already talked about these notifications. These are basically just reminders. I think the key thing about these reminders is, you send them a nice reminder in the morning, and then maybe another reminder in the afternoon, and then if they still haven't done it, maybe the next day you send it to their manager, just depending on how. Usually when a manager's name's copied, people seem to do it quicker versus if you just send a reminder to them and no one's been notified. I'm not going. There's other things to back up or monitor. And so I've come up with some dashboards to monitor. I'm going to go through these real quick. This is a dashboard showing a rollout of a new PMO, and what you want to see is resource usage growth increasing over time, and that's what this is showing as more and more people rolled out into the PMO. Same thing with users not logged in or timesheets. There's trends that you can watch, and what you want to see is as you're rolling out more and more things, the slope might increase, and then all of a sudden it should start leveling off as people become aware of how the cycles are, and when cycles are supposed to be completed. So putting it all together, identify those big monitoring hits. Start with some manual monitoring. After that's done, build some automated processes with notifications to keep that PMO running smoothly, and then build some dashboards to show the trends. And then once you do it, and you're happy, just keep repeating. When should you be doing your PMO monitoring? I say you do it right now. Even when you start rolling out a new PMO with Project Server, you can start capturing these trends and helping people get started with a new implementation by providing them reminders. And I've already hit the slide about the Trusted IT Group, so that's who's sponsoring this, and most of you are probably aware of us. And so for more information, you can go to the trusteditgroup.com. I post a lot of this stuff on my blog, myprojectexpert.com, and then you can send an email to me or sales@trusteditgroup.com. And so that's all I got. If you got any questions,